In the shadows of forgotten Appalachia lies a story so vile, so unthinkable, it forces us to question what human beings are truly capable of. This is not the tale of a haunted house or a vengeful spirit. It is far worse. It is the story of a girl who was never given a choice, a family that defied morality itself, and a town that turned a blind eye to decades of horror. She didn't just live with her father. She married him. Tonight, we dive into the nightmare of the most disturbing family in America. A chilling descent into isolation, inbreeding, violence, and the unspeakable bond that destroyed generations. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear will twist your stomach and haunt your sleep. Deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies a town that most maps forgot. Once a coal mining hub, the place was reduced to ashes when the industry collapsed. Families that stayed behind lived in isolation, surviving off scraps, odd jobs, and each other. Locals whispered of strange households, tucked away along dirt roads where outsiders rarely ventured. Among them was the Holloway family. Their property sat at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by forest so thick sunlight barely touched the ground. The Holloways never mingled in town, never welcomed visitors, and yet they were always talked about. People said they married only within their own bloodline. Generations of cousins marrying cousins, brothers marrying sisters. But the most disturbing story of all, the one whispered in hushed tones at the diner, was about Mary Holloway, a pale, withdrawn girl who was never seen in school. It was said her father, John Holloway, a man with piercing eyes and an unsettling grin, had not only kept her hidden, but eventually married her. The family's house became a symbol of everything forbidden. Windows covered with thick curtains, strange sounds at night, and the occasional glimpse of figures moving in candlelight. Travelers who broke down near their road often reported a heavy silence in the woods, as if the land itself wanted them gone. Rumors spread of children born with unsettling features, sunken eyes, twisted limbs, and faces that looked decades older than they should. Police rarely intervened. The Holloways knew the sheriff. They were left alone because no one wanted to stir the hornet's nest. But some people knew the truth. They had seen Mary as a child, quiet and trembling, clutching her father's arm like it was the only thing tethering her to life. When she disappeared from the town's view for years, only to return wearing a wedding ring and carrying a swollen belly, the whispers turned into horrified silence. This wasn't just another Appalachian rumor. It was real. And it was only the beginning of one of the darkest stories in America's forgotten towns. The first time outsiders truly suspected something was wrong with the Holloways came during a cold October night in 1989. A young couple, travelers passing through the mountains, had taken a wrong turn and ended up on the gravel road leading to the Holloway property. Their car broke down just half a mile from the house. With no cell service and only the sound of crickets and distant owls, they decided to approach the eerie farmhouse for help. What they found was something out of a nightmare. A man, later identified as John Holloway, answered the door shirtless, his skin stretched pale and waxy under the lantern light. His grin revealed rotting teeth, and his eyes glimmered with a mixture of suspicion and hunger. Behind him stood a girl, no older than 16, with hollow cheeks, wide eyes, and a hand nervously clutching the frame of the doorway. She wore a thin nightgown despite the cold, and her silence was louder than any scream. The travelers claimed the smell inside the house was unbearable, like rot and mold clinging to the wood. They were never invited in. John insisted on bringing water out himself, filling a rusted tin cup and handing it to them with a stare that felt like it pierced straight through. As they turned to leave, the young girl whispered something. The couple could never recall the exact words, only that it sounded like, "Please, don't leave me." Terrified, they hurried back to their car, and after hours of fiddling with the engine in panic, managed to drive off. When they told the local sheriff the next morning, he brushed it off as mountain folks being mountain folks. The sheriff warned them to stay out of other people's business, his tone making it clear that pressing further would be dangerous. But the couple never forgot that night. The image of the trembling girl in the doorway haunted them for years. They were certain she was in danger, and as the town would later discover, their instincts were right. That brief encounter was the first glimpse into the true horror of the Holloway family, a horror that was only beginning to unravel. To understand how the horror of Mary Holloway came to be, you must first understand the Holloway bloodline. The family's roots stretched back to the mid-1800s, when their ancestors settled deep in the Appalachian wilderness. Cut off from trade routes and unwilling to integrate with nearby towns, they lived off their own land and off each other. Over generations, this isolation gave birth to a dark cycle. Cousins marrying cousins, siblings becoming partners, and children born into a lineage where deformities became almost expected. Locals who dared to describe the Holloways often spoke in hushed voices. They told of children with wide, bulging eyes, noses swollen out of proportion, and crooked jaws that never seemed to close right. Some were said to speak in garbled tones, as if words struggled to escape their twisted lips. Others were silent altogether, staring through people like hollow-eyed specters. Still, the Holloways survived, not because they thrived, but because they kept to themselves, hidden in their decrepit home, living by rules only they understood. John Holloway was the patriarch of his generation, a man both feared and ridiculed. With his sunken cheeks, greasy black hair, and unsettling smile, he was the face most people associated with the family name. When his wife died mysteriously in her early 30s, townsfolk weren't surprised. They were, however, disturbed when rumors began swirling that John had grown too close to his daughter Mary. At first, people dismissed it as grotesque gossip, until Mary disappeared from all public view. Years later, when she reappeared as a teenager, it was not at school or in town. It was at the Holloway home, visibly pregnant and wearing a simple gold ring on her finger. No paperwork existed. No wedding was ever registered. But those who caught a glimpse of her swollen belly and downcast eyes whispered what nobody dared say out loud. Mary was not just John's daughter. She was his wife. The family closed ranks even tighter after that. Windows were nailed shut. Curtains never opened. Visitors were met at the door with cold glares. The Holloways became an untouchable legend. Everyone knew something horrific was happening inside, but nobody dared challenge it. After all, in that forgotten town, the Holloways were more powerful in fear than the law itself. By the mid-1990s, whispers about the Holloway family had grown into something more sinister. Strange disappearances in the nearby woods were being linked to their land. Hunters who never returned. Drifters who vanished without a trace. And even children who strayed too far from their yards. For years, these cases remained unsolved, brushed off as accidents, or people simply leaving town. But one deputy, a young officer new to the county, decided to look closer. His name was Daniel Price. Unlike the older sheriff, Price wasn't tied to local politics or generations of silence. He had heard the rumors, but what troubled him most was the story of Mary Holloway, whispers of a girl who had become both daughter and bride. One autumn afternoon, he drove out toward the Holloway property, under the guise of checking a missing person report. The gravel road seemed endless, swallowed by trees that pressed in like walls. His cruiser rattled over potholes until he reached the sagging farmhouse. The moment he stepped out, an unnatural stillness gripped him. No birds, no wind, just silence. He noticed old toys scattered in the dirt yard, dolls with missing heads, a tricycle rusting into the soil. The house itself looked alive, the wood swollen and warped as if it were breathing. Daniel knocked. No answer. He circled the house, peering through cracks in boarded windows. That's when he saw it. Inside, by the dim light of a single lantern, sat Mary Holloway. She was rocking in a wooden chair, her hair tangled, her skin pale and waxy. A child, no older than 3, clung to her leg. But what struck Daniel most was the child's face. The features were unmistakably warped, a nose bent unnaturally to the side, eyes that seemed too far apart, and lips twisted into a permanent half-frown. It was like looking at the Holloway bloodline, etched into a new generation. Before Daniel could process the roar, a shadow moved across the room. John Holloway appeared, stepping into view with a shotgun in hand. Their eyes locked through the crack in the boards, and in that moment, Daniel realized the family wasn't hiding. They were guarding something darker than anyone had dared to imagine. He retreated to his cruiser, the weight of what he saw pressing into his chest. But once you looked inside the Holloway house, there was no unseeing it, and the secrets buried in those woods had only just begun to surface. Deputy Daniel Price could have walked away, just like everyone else in town. But what he had seen through those boarded windows haunted him every night. He began digging quietly, reading old town records, tracing missing person reports, and interviewing those who once lived near the Holloways before fleeing. What he uncovered painted a picture more grotesque than even the darkest rumors suggested. For decades, the Holloways hadn't just been an isolated family. They had been systematically keeping outsiders who strayed too close. People who broke down on the road, drifters with no family ties, hunters who wandered off paths. They vanished into the forest and were never seen again. Price pieced together evidence that suggested these outsiders were absorbed into the Holloway bloodline, forced into their twisted cycle of breeding. Some lived long enough to escape, their minds fractured, but most never left. Their descendants bore the marks of captivity, distorted features, cognitive struggles, bodies that seemed worn down before their time. The most horrifying discovery came from a hidden birth record Price uncovered in the county archives. It listed Mary Holloway as the mother, but under father, the name John Holloway was typed in bold, and beneath it, another child's record appeared, years later, with the same entries. Mary had not just married her father. She had given birth to his children, raising them under the roof of the same man who had stolen her childhood. Price brought his findings to the sheriff, but instead of support, he was met with a cold warning. "You don't know what you're stirring, boy," the sheriff said, sliding the papers back across the desk. "The Holloway's been here longer than you. Best let the past be the past." It was clear the sheriff was either afraid or complicit. But the real twist came when Price returned to the Holloway property, mind to gather evidence himself. Under the cover of night, he crept through the woods and found something buried behind the house. Rows of small, crude wooden crosses, nearly swallowed by weeds. They weren't graves for pets. They were graves for children. Dozens of them. children who had never lived long enough to carry the Holloway name. And in that moment, Price realized the family's horror wasn't just in their present, it was carved into the very soil they lived on. The Holloways weren't a family anymore. They were a legacy of death. Deputy Daniel Price knew he had seen too much. The crosses behind the Holloway house were burned into his memory, but he needed proof if he wanted anyone outside the county to listen. Armed with nothing more than a disposable camera, he returned a week later, determined to capture the horror. But the Holloways were waiting. As he crept toward the property under a cloudy night sky, the woods fell into that same unnatural silence. Price raised his camera toward the boarded windows, heart pounding. Through the lens he saw Mary again, rocking in that same wooden chair, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow, and another child now clinging to her lap. She looked directly at him, as though she had been expecting his return. Then the boards shifted. A shotgun blast shattered the night, splinters flying from the porch. Price dove to the ground as John Holloway's voice echoed through the trees. "Ain't no outsiders welcome here." More shadows moved in the windows. He realized it wasn't just John. There were others. Grown children, twisted by years of inbreeding, staring with blank, expressionless faces. Their silhouettes filled the windows like a grotesque audience. Price ran, sprinting back into the woods, branches tearing at his uniform. Behind him, heavy footsteps pounded the ground. Someone, or something, was chasing him. He stumbled over roots, barely holding onto the camera as he pushed through the darkness. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, wheezing breaths, guttural laughs, the crack of another shotgun. Finally, he reached his cruiser. Fumbling with the keys, he threw himself inside, just as a figure emerged from the tree line. A man with bulging eyes and a twisted jaw, wielding a rusted axe. Price slammed the accelerator, gravel flying as headlights cut through the blackness. In the rearview mirror, he saw them, the Holloways, standing at the edge of the woods, a cluster of deformed faces illuminated in the beams. John stood in front, shotgun resting against his shoulder, smiling that rotten grin. Price escaped with his life, but he knew the Holloways weren't finished. They had guarded their secret for generations, and anyone who dared to uncover it was marked. The danger wasn't over. It had only just begun. Deputy Daniel Price managed to get out of the mountains alive, but what he carried with him weighed heavier than any scar. He filed his report, sent the photographs of the crosses and the Holloway house to state investigators, but nothing came of it. The files vanished, and officials dismissed his claims as lack of credible evidence. It was the same story the town had followed for decades: silence, denial, and fear. Price left the county soon after. He knew the Holloways would never forgive his intrusion. Yet the story didn't end with him. Whispers spread through Appalachia, new hikers gone missing, strange lights flickering in the woods, the sound of crying children echoing at night near the Holloway Road. Locals swore the family still lived there, locked in their rotten farmhouse, breeding generation after generation in secret. No one dared approach after dark. Mary Holloway, the girl who became both daughter and bride, was never seen again outside those boarded windows. Some say she died in childbirth. Others believe she still rocks silently in her chair, nursing deformed children while her father-turned-husband watches from the shadows. The truth is swallowed by the mountains, guarded by the Holloway bloodline. What makes this story so disturbing is not just the grotesque union of father and daughter, but how easily a town chose to look away. How silence, fear, and denial allowed horror to thrive in plain sight. The Holloways may be hidden in their corner of Appalachia, but they are not unique. Families like them exist wherever darkness festers unchallenged, waiting for someone unfortunate enough to stumble too close. So the next time you're driving through a forgotten road, deep in the woods, and you see a sagging farmhouse with its windows covered, remember Mary Holloway. Remember the man at the door with the rotten grin, and ask yourself, what would you do if someone inside whispered, "Please, don't leave me"? Because sometimes the most horrifying monsters aren't ghosts or demons. They're family.